Hi, I'm Rachael Brown. I'm the Chief Reporter at the Farmers Guardian.
And I'm Jane Thynne, news reporter at the Farmers Guardian.
We're reporting here from the NFU conference here in London. And this morning there was 20 John Deere tractors parked outside the conference in demonstration against the inheritance tax proposals that the government are planning to put in place. There is also, of course, a display outside of pre-loved farm toys that were donated by farmers up and down the country to emulate the impact this inheritance tax proposals will have on multi-generational families, farming families, whether that's owner-occupied or tenant farmers. So really setting the scene for the conference out there in terms of family farm tax, really dominating discussions here. And that kind of carried through, didn't it, Jane, into the political session, which was at the start this morning. Yeah,
it was a really sort of sombre mood. There was no sort of thunderous applause, and Tom arrived very sort of business-like, with his sleeves rolled up and very very resolute in his message, but unfortunately that message is that nothing is changed, and the main issue of inheritance tax is just where we were in October.
No, definitely. And Defra were really keen ahead of this conference to come here and deliver some positive news, and there were some positive announcements. For example, the extension of the seasonal workers visa scheme for 5 years, as an announcement of an investment in the Farm Technology Fund. Also the announcement of public procurement, so really trying to kind of measure how much food from our hospitals and schools and prisons are using kind of locally sourced high standard quality food. Which is, in any other year of an NFU conference would be fully applauded and praised. But there is this real strong feeling here, and I think that was emulated in the Q&A afterwards, that the family farm tax, whilst that exists, that is the overarching worry and anxiety for all farmers. So whilst they have all these positive announcements that they're making, essentially they're not landing how they would maybe 12 months ago before this policy was introduced.
No, and I think all the questions to the floor, they were all about the inheritance tax. I think they had tried to mix them up, but inevitably it just came back to that. And David Passmore had a really poignant message that the Defra Secretary just wasn't equipped to answer at all. And just refused to answer.
And it was noticeable, the tension in the room in response to that answer. It was a very emotive story about how family farm tax would impact his farm. I think he said his mum was 90 years old, a widow. And speaking to David afterwards, it was just, he wanted that kind of empathy and understanding and recognition that he acknowledges that this proposal is putting particularly the elderly farmers, which we've heard before, in a really difficult position. And I think he wanted that acknowledgement, but there wasn't really that, was there? No. And it was almost like, in his words, he can't comment on individual circumstances.
But I mean, as David said to us, he wasn't speaking individually, speaking for thousands, and it is that sort of message that Defra just not getting. And if they are, they're just ignoring it because they've been told to ignore it.
I think an interesting point which was made by the NFU president Tom Bradshaw in a press huddle with media afterwards was, he was asked, what will it take for this inheritance tax proposal to change? And he said it would be a political moment, an economic change for them to turn tact on it. To change tact.
The belief, I think, among the NFU, and I think the only hope that they can sort of cling on to now, is that that Defra know it's wrong, that they know that they are on side in that view, but they are in a position that they just can't take that belief any further. And that, like Rachael said, there needs to be actually, now this has happened, we can do this.
And there was still the pleas, wasn't it, to the Chancellor, Rachael Reeves, to come and have a discussion round the table. That is still definitely the narrative going forward. But the reality of that happening, we do not know. But it feels at the moment the next key milestone is going to be that autumn finance bill.
Which will take this almost to a year, which is unheard of, really, to keep the union done so well to keep it in the headlines, and there's to keep keep it on the front pages and to keep the farmers sort of behind it. And but yeah, we are looking at autumn, which is what, 7 or 8 months away.
And we did ask, we put it to the President Tom Bradshaw in terms of following that Treasury officials meeting last Tuesday, I think it was. Has there been any further dialogue, any further contact or communication? In which he said no.
No, that's it. Yeah.
So complete deadlock with talks.
Yeah, and that is very much the atmosphere here. I mean, it's not a normal conference in the sense they did the fringe meetings, were all webinars, so you don't have that sort of dashing around and people going to different sessions. It is all quite, there's an overarching feeling of low morale, I think, isn't
it? No, definitely. And I think that frustration and anger and upset definitely came through in that Q&A session in terms of the amount of times that the Secretary of State was interrupted by the floor. Normally it's quite an organised, you wait your turn, you're given the microphone, but people felt so passionate to speak out that they couldn't wait their turn and they wanted to talk up and they had to kind of be moderated, didn't they?
Yeah, and all the time this sort of tractor horns that were outside all the time and hooting and stuff while he was actually making his speech. And then again, when he came to speak to the journalists, they were under the window. And they
made sure it was known that they were still outside, definitely. So that's our roundup of NFU conference. In terms of next steps, the NFU very much want to kind of keep the public on side. That's a real focus point for them. We've got the rally happening on Pancake Day, haven't we, down in Westminster?
Next Tuesday. Yeah.
And their real focus now is to concentrate on those backbencher MPs, really try and lobby them to really raise the concerns to government of what their constituents are saying around the family farm tax, and almost focus on the rural MPs, but also those inner city MPs too, but very much trying to ensure that we keep the public on side, which we have done up until this point as a sector.
Yeah, that's definitely the message. Take it wider now into cities and to just try and impress on people what the value of farming is in this world that's getting ever more. Geopolitics are changing and food will become ever more important. So yeah, that's the message from the NFU.
No, definitely. And don't forget, the Farmers Guardian are hosting a webinar tomorrow night, 7 till 8 o'clock. We've had a lot of people sign up, and it's not too late to sign up if you haven't already. It's free. Just go to our website, farmersguardian.com, and you'll see a link and you can sign up there. We've got an expert panel to put your questions to around the fallout of inheritance tax and how you can plan best for your farm business. So do join us if you can tomorrow night, 7 till 8 o'clock. Alistair, just give your summary today on the general kind of feeling and reaction that you're getting from farmers here at conference.
The farmers here at conference are telling me much the same thing that I hear when I speak to farmers right across the countryside. Obviously, I represent Orkney and Shetland, so I hear a lot from farmers there. My own farms in Islay, I hear from farmers there right across Scotland. Last weekend, I was in Wales and then I was in the West Country. And, everybody feels that somehow or another, because of the inheritance tax proposals, they've been backed into a corner. But that means that there's only really one way to break this impasse, and that's for the government to move. I'm pretty sure that if the government moved, then farmers are brimful of ideas about what they could do differently to achieve the ends that the government, or some people in the government, say they want to achieve, which is basically ending the abuse of APR and BPR for the super rich people who are not farmers, wanting to use it to shelter their wealth on inheritance. But you only get that conversation started if somebody makes the first move, and that's got to be the Treasury.
In your opinion, what will it take for this government to make any changes or make a move? NFU President Tom Bradshaw said there needs to be an economic change or a political moment for them to budge on this.
I think we have to manufacture our own political moment here, and increasingly you see all the signs coming from Treasury that actually, they don't want to change. They're doubling down. It's easier, they think, to double down than to admit that they got this one wrong and they made a mistake. the people who can persuade them actually that they do need to make some movement in this, any movement, are the people on the government backbenches. And I hear from them directly. Many of them will tell me that they're beginning to talk about it publicly. The press often reports this as being Labour MPs saying something different. They say to me, actually, we're saying the same things that we've been saying privately, but we've not been listened to either. Remember here, this is something that is not going to come to a vote in the House of Commons for another 7 or 8 months. That's a long time for any government, let alone one that is burning through political capital like this one, but for any government to think that they can double down and tough it out. So, the campaign's got to continue, because giving in is not an option, but it's not a hopeless cause by any way, shape or form.
The TFA Chief Executive George Dunn mentioned last week, following the Treasury meeting, that he had heard from a number of backbencher Labour MPs that had moved away from this inheritance tax policy, put their head over the pulpit and spoke up about it, that have asked and requested for a meeting with the Chancellor and had no response. Why is there this kind of wall put up by the Chancellor and not willing to at least have conversations and discussions?
I think actually what you're seeing here is a very obvious illustration of a problem that actually goes across the whole of Whitehall in the way that government does business. And the truth of the matter is that actually Treasury has far too much say and control. Now, this is where having the balance within government matters. So Treasury are very good at working out the numbers, if they're given the numbers to work with, but they don't always get the politics right. That's where actually the other government departments, in this case Defra, and also 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister himself has got some responsibility here. You bring in these other political forces and you then create that balance between politics and economics. They've got that balance wrong at the moment. A lot of the figures are questionable about the economic case, but the Treasury seems to be blind to the damage that this is doing to the Labour Party politically in communities where they have representation for the first time in decades. So, I'm not a Labour backbencher. I've never been a member of the Labour Party. I joined the Liberals as a 14-year-old, would you believe it, and I've stayed there ever since. But if I were a Labour MP today, I think I would be looking to Treasury and saying, you've got to shift in this. And if you double down, if you ignore me in the same way that you're ignoring the industry out there, then I'm not going to just put up with that. Because the most powerful people in any government are the people who are on the government backbenches, because without them, there's no government majority. Without a majority, there's no government.
But Alistair, do you think this government is content in the fact that if they continue on with this family to farm tax policy, that they could lose these rural seats, but they're actually okay with that?
Well, I think that would be a foolish calculation, because, this is not the only area where government is losing support. You saw it right across the country, rural and urban, in relation to the removal of a universal winter fuel allowance for pensioners. You're seeing it now with the effects of the national insurance contribution rise and the lowering of the threshold, the increase in the level of the minimum wage. That's really hitting small businesses right across the country. So even if the Labour Party thought that they could treat their rural seats as being dispensable, I think that would be fundamentally wrong, because there was a real political opportunity for Keir Starmer at the start of this Parliament. He had this massive majority, and he had won seats in communities right across the country that they had never been anywhere near, even in Tony Blair's day back in 1997. That would have been a moment when actually you could have created a better sense of unity. You could have healed some of the division that you have between rural and urban communities, and some of the other divides then between the richer and the poorer people. These divisions could all have been cured, or at least we could have made some progress towards curing them. But I'm afraid now you've squandered that political opportunity, and the only way there is ever going to be any chance of recreating it is for the Treasury to accept their mistake and to start talking in a meaningful and respectful way to rural communities.
Robbie, just give me your initial reaction to the Secretary of State's speech today and how he handled that Q&A session afterwards.
Well, first, it's incredibly frustrating that yet again the Secretary of State has turned up at the NFU conference following a meeting that he had not only with the NFU but the CLA, the CAAV and the Tenant Farmers Association earlier last week, as the Treasury team have done, and no movement whatsoever on the agricultural property relief and business property relief, and that has been the main theme of today. That's where all of the questions came from the floor predominantly, and yet the Secretary of State is not even willing to acknowledge the dire consequences that this Labour government's decision on IHT is having on many of our farming businesses, but also food security. In that Q&A session, there was some really emotive stories that farmers were telling the Secretary of State, and it has come under criticism, particularly by one farmer, the reaction response that he got, and almost that he couldn't comment on individual circumstances. The Secretary of State can absolutely comment on the principle of the implications that his choice and his government's choice is having on our farming community. And he failed to do that today. There were scenarios that were given to him, scenarios that have also been expressed to me. I've sat around many farm kitchen tables having some of the most horrendous, really, really upsetting conversations based on choices that this government have made. And now, really, individuals being put in some dire situations of having to make some catastrophic decisions about family structure. And there were some points that had been put across to the Secretary of State today. He failed to even acknowledge them. And it really upsets me, actually, that there is a lack of willingness to even understand the issue by not only the Secretary of State, but the Chancellor hasn't even met with anybody yet, and indeed the Prime Minister. This government has got to start listening, not only to the NFU, but to all of those stakeholders and indeed our farmers, to understand the dire consequences of this. And I hope they do so before the finance bill goes through in June. In your opinion, what do you think is stopping the Chancellor having those discussions and having that meeting? Well, it's her complete inability to engage. I mean, how easy would it be for the Chancellor to turn around and say, look, I want to get everybody back around the table. I would absolutely welcome that. I encourage the Chancellor to do that. I encourage all of those in positions of decision making to do that within the government. But there is consistently this door being shut to the stakeholders like the NFU, CLA, TFA, and indeed our wider farming community. So as the Shadow Farming Minister, I will continue to keep reiterating the implications that this tax is going to have on our farming businesses. There's that narrative, isn't there, that this decision lies with the Chancellor, and there isn't really much that the Defra Secretary or his farming minister can do to try and change this policy. Over the last couple of weeks, there has been some criticism that actually the farming minister and the Defra Secretary aren't doing enough to raise the concerns. They're not doing anything. Let's be very clear about that. We have had farming debate after farming debate in Westminster. We've now got to a stage where the Secretary of State and indeed the farming minister is not even turning up to the debates, and it's left to some junior Treasury minister to respond on the government's position. So the Secretary of State for Defra, the farming minister, is absent from these conversations. I feel that Steve Reed is very weak around the cabinet table. I question whether he's even raised this as a concern around the cabinet table in the first place. We should be having a Secretary of State and a farming minister that is standing up for the policy areas that they represent, not just kowtowing to the Labour government principles that we have in place at the moment. And because the consequences of their decisions is deeply damaging, not only for our farming businesses, but the wider rural economy and indeed food production, UK food security going forward. They've got to start listening. I can't emphasise that enough. In reality, do you think these lobbying efforts,
come autumn this year, do you think that actually there will be a change in this policy?
Well, we have to hope so, and I will do all I can alongside my shadow Defra colleagues here in Westminster. And I know that the NFU, the CLA, the Tenant Farmers Association have already been vocal, and I'm sure that they will continue to do that. And we already see that there is another rally down in Westminster on the 4th of March. I'm sure it will be well attended. I hope it is well attended, because we have to make sure that whether it's our farming community or those other impacted businesses, from business property relief particularly, and indeed the wider population, are making those concerns, because this will impact food prices and it will impact UK food security, and that impacts us all.
The NFU president, Tom Bradshaw, said today that he believes the government knows that it's wrong, but it's waiting for, say, an economic change or a political moment to try and make some amendments. Do you agree with that comment?
Well, this is an absolute vindictive tax, let's be honest about that. There has been no willingness to even listen, to engage. So my view is that this is the government being absolutely vindictive to our farming community. And we've seen that not only through the changes on IHT, but we've seen that through the dramatic drop that is hitting everybody's cash flows through de-linked payments, hitting everybody, every farming business's baseline this year. So this, in my view, is a government that don't actually care about our farming community. I hope that they are willing to change that principle. They have to, for the good of the nation, for the good of food security. And we're all duty bound, I think, to keep raising these concerns consistently. And I will come back on this issue time and time and time again until there is a change on this IHT policy.
And finally, something that you've brought up in multiple debates now is the impact on tenant farmers and how they're being considered within this current policy proposal. Obviously, when we raise about the tenant farmers issues, the government used the line of the tenant farming commissioner. We are appointing that tenant farming commissioner. Do you think that's enough? And what's being done right now to support tenants?
Well, George Dunn and his team at the Tenant Farmers Association have done a fantastic job in raising this issue at the heart of government. But yet again, the government are refusing to listen. Where I am really concerned about our tenant farmers is because they effectively don't have a voice in the consequences of the changes to APR and BPR, because their landlords, will now be making strategic decisions about how they mitigate their tax liability that potentially comes down the line as a result of this government's choice to bring that in.
And do you think the Treasury considered that?
No, not at all.